last time we discussed about the excess demand. Excess demand is a situation when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at full employment level of output. So which means that if the economy is in the capacity to produce a level of output where all the resources are being used fully, and then that means that is the aggregate maximum aggregate supply which it is producing, and then at that level of output the aggregate demand is greater than the maximum aggregate supply. Now there are reasons for which this might happen. The reasons being very simple. It is basically an increase in the components of aggregate supply. If you remember the components of aggregate demand, increase in the components of aggregate demand. Okay, and why does the aggregate demand or the components of aggregate demand increase? That is because of increase in the money supply. It is because of the increase in the money supply. So what happens ultimately? Increase in consumption expenditure, increase in investment, increase in government expenditure, increase in net exports, and all this happens because of increase in money supply. Okay. So when ultimately this happens, it has impact. Okay. So when what is the impact of excess demand? Let's just first see what can happen on employment. Okay. Since already there is full employment of resources, there cannot be increase in the employment level, because already the resources are fully utilized and therefore the aggregate supply is at its maximum. Okay, so as the level of employment cannot be increased, there will not be any increase in the employment. Similarly, output also cannot be increased because it is the maximum output. So therefore the impact of excess demand is basically on price. So the prices tend to increase, leading to inflation. The prices tend to increase, leading to inflation. Okay. So how do we correct? Because this is not a very ideal situation. Excess demand is not an ideal situation. So there should be some way in order to correct this situation. Okay, and that correction can only be done by reducing aggregate demand. Since AD is greater than AS, we need to reduce the aggregate demand. That is the measure. Okay, that is how we can correct the excess demand. But aggregate demand can be reduced only by reducing the money supply, money circulation. Okay, so that is the basic agenda. When there is excess demand, the basic agenda should be to reduce the money supply or money in circulation in the economy and thereby reduce the aggregate demand. Okay, so we're going to do that, and that's a very important topic, so please understand it very carefully. Measures to correct excess demand. and in brackets I'm going to write what we are going to do. We need to reduce the money supply and thereby reduce the aggregate demand. Okay. Now, the measures which can be undertaken are broadly classified into two: fiscal measures and monetary measures. Okay. Now, fiscal measure or fiscal policy is basically a policy relating to the government expenditure and receipt. Okay, which means impacting the government expenditure and receipt and thereby impacting the money in circulation and thereby impacting the aggregate demand. That is basically fiscal. Monetary, on the other hand, is basically measures undertaken by the central bank. So fiscal relating to government expenditure and receipt, and monetary relating to central bank's measures. Okay, so we're going to first do the fiscal policy. Okay, it is the expenditure and revenue policy of the government to accomplish the desired objective. Okay, now our main objective is to reduce the money supply and thereby reduce the aggregate demand. And the first component of fiscal policy is the revenue policy, and in that comes the main component, tax. If you remember the government budget, tax is the main component of revenue. Okay, during excess demand or inflation, the government should raise the taxes of all kinds. Why? Because tax withdraws the purchasing capacity of people. As the purchasing capacity of people reduces, their ability to buy reduces, and thereby the aggregate demand also reduces, and hence effective demand falls, and that is what we want. So during excess demand or inflation, the government should raise the rates of all taxes. This will reduce the purchasing power from the people and the taxpayers, and hence the effective demand of the economy will fall. So all taxes will be increased during inflation or excess demand. Okay, second policy under fiscal policy is the expenditure, which is the main component. Expenditure policy. Now, what is expenditure? Government's expenditure on various purposes like building roads, public works, all that. Okay, now during inflation, now what happens is when there is too much of expenditure, there is too much of employment. Okay, which means if there, like, I'll just give you one example. If there is road construction, people will be employed, money will be circulated more, there will be more income generation. When there is production, there will be income generation. When there is income generation, there will be more money supply. But our aim in excess demand is to reduce the money supply. So during the excess demand, what should the expenditure policy be? During inflation, the expenditures should be curtailed, which will reduce the employment, and hence when employment reduces, income generation will reduce, and therefore the money supply will reduce. So expenditure should reduce. Okay, so in situation of excess demand, government should curtail its expenditure on public works, thereby reducing money income of people. Thus the demand for goods and services will fall. Okay, third is public borrowing. Okay, now we have discussed this earlier in a very short thing during national income accounting. Government borrows from public. Okay, in the format of government bonds, mutual funds, all this. So what is happening? It floats these securities and the people invest in these securities, which is somewhat like loan by people to the government. Okay, and this is basically for a stipulated period of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, after which the government has to return this money back to the public, people who have invested, with interest. It's somewhat like, loan only. So what happens is, public borrowing is basically taking loan from public by the government. Okay, now you tell me, during inflation, I as the government need to reduce the money in hand of people. Should the government increase the public borrowing or reduce the public borrowing? It should increase the public borrowing. So what happens when the government floats the mutual funds? People will invest in the public borrowing, mutual funds and bonds. What will happen? The money in hand with the people will reduce because they will invest. Okay, so what happens? Their purchasing power thereby reduces, and therefore their ability to buy also reduces. Okay, so in times of excess demand, the government should resort to large scale public borrowing to reduce money in the hands of the public, and hence the demand for goods and services will fall. Okay, and the fourth concept under fiscal policy is deficit financing. Okay, now in simple layman's language, deficit financing is printing of new notes. Okay, now if new notes are printed, there will be more money in circulation. So you tell me, during inflation, should we print more new notes? No, we should curtail the printing of new notes. So at times of inflation, the deficit financing should be curtailed, should be reduced. Okay, so in times of excess demand, deficit financing should be cut down to reduce money supply in the economy. This will reduce the effective demand. I hope this is clear. I hope you've understood this. Okay, so this was the fiscal policy. Okay, the second kind of policy is monetary policy, and as I said, these are the measures undertaken by the central bank. Okay, so monetary policy can be divided into quantitative and qualitative measures. Okay, now these qualitative measures are directions and directives to the commercial bank. Quantitative measures are direct measures undertaken by the central bank. Okay, now these quantitative measures we've already done. The first being repo rate. You've done this. Repo rate. Repo rate is the rate at which central bank lends to the commercial banks for short-term credit. Okay, now what happens? See, this is basically monetary policy. Basically impacts the credit availability. So more credit means more demand. Less credit means less demand. So we need to lessen the credit. So during inflation, the central bank increases the repo rate. When repo rate is increased, the commercial banks are forced to increase the interest rate. Now when the interest rates are increased, loans become expensive. So what happens to the loans? Loans will reduce. When loans reduce, aggregate demand will reduce. So during excess demand, repo rates are increased. Okay. So what is repo rate? It is the rate at which central bank provides short-term loans to commercial banks. In situation of inflation, central bank raises the repo rate, which discourages commercial banks from borrowing from central bank. Increase in repo rate forces commercial banks to increase the interest rates. This makes credit costlier, leading to fall in aggregate demand, first leading to fall in demand for loans and thereby reducing the effective demand. Okay. Second is bank rate. Okay. Now bank rate is similar to repo rate, but these are the rates of interest charged by central bank on commercial bank on long term credits. So what is bank rate? It is the rate at which the central bank provides long term loans to commercial banks. In situation of inflation, bank rates are increased. Okay. The bank this discourages commercial banks from borrowing from central bank, and what happens, they are forced to increase the interest rate. Now when the interest rates are increased, loans become expensive, therefore the demand for loans falls. When the demand for loans fall, effective demand or the aggregate demand falls. Okay, I hope this you have understood repo rate and bank rate. The third is reverse repo rate. Reverse repo rate. Okay, it is the rate at which the commercial banks keep their deposits with the central bank. So when we keep deposits, we get interest. Similarly, commercial banks keep their deposits in central bank and in turn get an interest from the central bank. So similar, that is the reverse repo rate. So during inflation, what happens? The reverse repo rate is increased. So what happens here is the commercial banks are keen to keep their deposits in central bank rather than giving it as loan. So when the reverse repo rate is increased, the loan giving capacity or their inclination to give loan reduces. When the loans reduce, the effective demand will reduce, and hence the corrective action is done. So in times of inflation, central bank raises the reverse repo rate so that the commercial banks are encouraged to keep their deposits in central bank than to give them as loan to public. With the loan creation by commercial banks, when the loan creation by commercial banks contract, the effective demand also falls. Okay, the fourth is cash reserve ratio. Now it's a statutory requirement by the central bank to the commercial banks that a certain percentage of their deposits have to be kept as reserves in the central bank. Okay, so the ratio of the total deposits that have to be kept as reserve in the central bank is cash reserve ratio. So during inflation, the central bank mandatorily increases the cash reserve ratio. Now when the cash reserve ratio increases, the commercial bank's ability to give loan reduces. When the loans reduce, aggregate demand falls. Okay, right? Again, cash reserve ratio refers to the minimum percentage of total deposits that commercial banks have to keep as reserve in central bank. During inflation, central bank raises CRR, which contracts credit creation capacity of the commercial banks. This in turn leads to fall in effective demand. Okay, a similar technique is statutory liquidity ratio. Okay, now there is a small slight difference between SLR and CRR. This SLR is basically the percentage of total deposits that have to be kept by the commercial bank themselves. So this is the reserve which has to be kept in central bank. This is the reserve which they have to keep with themselves only. They have to keep it and they can't give as loan. Okay, so what is SLR? It refers to the minimum percentage of total deposits that banks have to be keeping as reserve by commercial banks themselves. During inflation, central bank increases the statutory liquidity ratio, which contracts the credit creation capacity of the commercial banks, and hence the effective demand will fall. Okay. Sixth is open market operations. Okay, now actually this is very simple. It refers to buying and selling of government securities to commercial banks or public in open market. That means central banks selling the government securities, government bonds, government securities to the commercial banks and the public. Okay, now buying, like if central bank buys the securities, it is actually increasing the purchasing capacity, that but the money will flow from central bank to the commercial bank or public. So when it is flowing from central bank to commercial bank and public, the money in hand with the public is going to increase, but we need to reduce the money in hand or money in circulation. So what should be done in open market, buying or selling? Central bank should sell government securities. So what will happen? Government securities will go to the public and money will go to the central bank. So the money in hand of the public will fall. Therefore, aggregate demand will fall. Okay. So what is open market operation? It refers to buying and selling of government securities to commercial banks or public in the open market. During inflation, central bank sells government securities in the open market. This reduces the credit creation capacity of commercial banks and money supply in the economy, which in turn leads to fall in the effective demand. Okay. Now these are the quantitative measures which we have discussed: repo rate, bank rate, reverse repo rate, cash reserve ratio, statutory liquidity ratio, and open market operations. Apart from this, we have qualitative measures also, and these qualitative measures are directives to the commercial banks by central bank. The first qualitative measure is margin requirement. Okay, margin requirement. Now what is this margin requirement? Margin is actually the difference between security value and loan, and this security is always going to be greater than the value of the loan. Okay, now if this margin is high, this means that the loan is expensive. If the margin is less, loan is cheap. And during inflation, we have to make the loan expensive. So what should be done to the margin requirement? Margin requirement should be raised. Okay, so the central bank instructs all commercial banks to increase the margin requirement. That is the difference between security and loan. This will make loan very expensive. People will not go to take loan, and therefore aggregate demand will fall. Okay, so what is margin requirement? It is the difference between the amount of loan and market value of securities offered against loan. During inflation, central bank directs commercial banks to increase margin, which makes loan expensive, and then demand falls. This in turn leads to fall in effective demand. Demand for loan falls first and then the effective demand also falls. Okay. The second qualitative measure is moral suasion. Like persuasion, we have moral suasion. Okay. Now what is suasion? It's basically an order, written or oral, and it can be a directive also. Now during inflation, central bank directs commercial banks to reduce loan. That directive is basically moral suasion. Okay. So what is moral suasion? These are written or oral orders or directives by central bank to commercial banks to expand or contract credit. During inflation, central bank directs commercial banks to contract credit and hence effective demand falls. Okay, right? So this is one part of disequilibrium at full employment, that is excess demand. Deficient demand we'll be doing in the next video.